Hey everybody, Ty here. Hope everyone's doing well on this wonderful Saturday evening. Things have been quite interesting in regards to our seasonal outlook here. This is the final outlook for winter, and we've been dealing with a couple of glitches here. So, obviously, we're trying to look at December, January, and February here, but for whatever reason, we haven't gotten an update in. We seem like we're still kind of stuck, or the link maybe is messed up right now, the coding, something like that. But we're trying to get December, January, and February, and the month is not available. So we're going to kind of improv this. We're going to kind of skip ahead. We're going to look at January, February, and March, but we're also going to try to at least try to make some speculation as to what to expect for next month. I mean, we did do the monthly outlook about a day ago, so definitely check that video out if you want a little bit more insight on that. But as far as the 3 month average, we're not really going to have a full on graph like we do in the other videos. So, that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. So, this is going to kind of look a lot like the bleed off that we saw from the December outlook, where the cold air is going to be kind of pushing in from the northwest. I do think there's going to be a lot of variability with this because remember, a weak La Nina is still a La Nina, so you're obviously going to see the northwestern states and the northern states being cooler than average, and the southern states typically being warmer than average. But with weaker La Ninas, there's a lot more variability in those forecasts. In other words, that means that there's going to be potential for more pushes of cold air to come off to the south here, and a lot more unpredictability as well. Now, one thing that I have noticed when I take a look at this graph here is like we're flirting with being right at the edge of a weak La Nina and shifting back into a neutral Enzo, which further lowers my confidence in exactly what we'll see. I think it's obviously, of course, going to be more of a week to week basis type of thing, truthfully, if I'm being honest. But either way, from the way things look now, the storm tracking definitely seems to favor more of the central and midwestern states being impacted by potential winter weather. And there are a lot of analogs that go along with that as well. And I'm going to be discussing those later in the video. I don't want anyone to be concerned by said analogs because I mean, I find them interesting, but I don't necessarily think that those are law, so to speak. But if we keep things rolling here and we look over towards the southern states, it's no surprise that we're expecting above average temperatures, particularly over towards the desert southwest. I would really say a lot of this is going to be closer to near normal. These aren't going to be the highest above normal values that we've seen, 40 to 50%, but still a notable signal nonetheless for a 3 month average. And the same can be said for the deep south. I think the southeast ridge is going to keep things in play, keep us warm, and keep us out of play for a lot of action here. Not to say, though, that there can't be cracks within the foundation here, so to speak. I would say that last year we were kind of leaning into that neutral Enzo, and Atlanta ended up getting, 3 to 4 inches of snow within a day. So, again, like I said before, nothing's really off the table as of yet, especially at this range where things can change at the drop of a dime. One crazy forecast run can change everything. We're even going to be taking a close look at Alaska here, particularly. And the most interesting thing that I've made note of, and this has kind of become a signal that I've kind of linked with some of the stratospheric heating, even polar vortex, dare I say at times, is where the northern half of the state will sometimes be warmer than average, and then the southern half will be colder than average. I'm seeing that signal predominantly throughout the last few runs, especially in December's outlook as well. And like I said, there seems to be a lot of runoff from December's outlook into this current outlook for January, February, and March of 2026. So something else we'll have to pay extra close attention to. So we'll go ahead and go further, and we'll actually take a look at the February, March, and April map. So obviously April is the end of winter heading into spring, and we obviously have those above average temperatures becoming more abundant in deep south, but that colder signal still remains as of right now for the northern states. This also kind of piques my interest towards maybe the back half of the season, because things really tend to get wacky, especially towards the deep south as we get towards maybe February and early March. There's still even potential for winter storms on the other end of the spectrum, but also you have to start thinking about severe weather coming into play as well. We always talk about the collision between warm and cold air masses and what that means. And usually during this time of year, the troughs really start to pick up in intensity as well. So my interest really starts to peak around this time as well in regards to the potential for increased weather activity as a whole. This is usually a pretty busy time of year, so keep an eye out for this time, especially with these early signals we have here. We'll be making further updates, and probably within the next month and a half or so, we'll probably even have a spring outlook, our first preview of a spring outlook, I should say. So obviously, we aren't just looking at the temperatures here, we're going to be looking at our moisture. And this is kind of typical for a La Nina signal to see the southern states drier than average, especially over towards the deep south and the coastal south, also the Gulf states being drier than average. A really strong signal particularly pops up around the Atlantic southeast and over towards the Florida panhandle and even parts of the northern peninsula. It's not anything that's too far out of the norm. Usually the biggest source of moisture that allows for showers and storms to occur over towards this region is Gulf moisture. And whenever you have the southeast ridge here, which is a high pressure area, it usually ends up keeping a lot of that moisture flow hampered off to the deep south, and actually in the Gulf itself, the moisture kind of feeds back in and stays away. Sometimes you can get a little bit of action over here towards the southern part of the peninsula here, but it's a bit of a stretch. And then on top of that, we would need more frontal boundaries to come into to help increase the amount of forcing needed for storms. Over towards the desert southwest, it can be a little bit of a wild card. That's why there's not as high of a probability of below average precip there. But the further south you go, the probabilities really start to increase for that drop off in precip. Now, of course, another typical calling card for La Nina is increased amount of moisture here over towards the northwestern and northern states as well. And the most interesting signal that I've seen, this kind of goes further along with that potential stratospheric heating and polar vortex type setup, is we'll see the Great Lakes tend to be a lot more active. This does seem like it's a pattern that could be favorable for lake effect snow here. So areas like Chicago, over towards Detroit, Cleveland, Gary, Indiana, and many others, I would be very watchful towards this area. And then remember, even though not all of these areas were included within that below average temperature reading that we got for the seasonal outlook here, what you need to remember is if we have any moisture that coincides along with some of these cold air pushes that we're going to be seeing, dare I say even cold blast, this will increase the likelihood for wintry precipitation. So I'm watching this area very closely. And there are a lot of analogs that kind of agree with this above average precip value, maybe even the threat of increased winter weather here to go along with it. So let's go ahead and move this forward because we're going to do the same treatment for this as we did the temperature outlook. You can see that we have a notable drop off in the amount of confidence for precip as we head into the February, March, April timeframe here. But the signal still ends up remaining over towards the Great Lakes states and over towards the Midwest. So I do think that this is going to end up resulting in a pretty active winter for this region here, particularly. Anywhere along the Mississippi and Missouri River regions here, especially into the valleys, it could get pretty active as well. Over towards the mountains, I do expect a pretty good ski season over there for these regions. We've been talking about the ski seasons, the ski weather, or skiing conditions on and off, I should say, over towards some of these states. Still kind of new to that, but that's a members only thing, so definitely urge you to check that out too. But outside of that, as far as the southern states, nothing really changes here. We're expecting the same La Nina signal, even though at this point I would actually expect us to shift back into a neutral ENSO by this time frame. We've been talking about that particularly with these last winter previews that we talked about, where we're in a weak La Nina right now. We're actually going to be shifting into a neutral ENSO by the time we get towards the January, February, March timeframe, and confidence only increases with that further as we head into February, April, and March. You can even see this highlighted by the graph here. By the time we get into January, February, March, you're already seeing the 60% chance, and it actually increases beyond 70 by the time we get towards February and beyond that point. So this shift from La Nina to neutral ENSO is going to really keep us on our toes, so to speak. So now let's go ahead and look at some of our oscillations here. And this kind of only further highlights my confidence in maybe potential big polar plunges, maybe even polar vortexes occurring, is whenever you see this signal here for stratospheric heating, It's a really warm air mass that pops up over here around the Gulf of Alaska, just to the south of it. And if you see that, you see that again pop up around January, and it even hangs around, and it finally starts to weaken by the time we get towards February. By the time we look towards March, it's not as strong of a signal, but it looks like there could be even another push with that as well. And this kind of further increases that unpredictability here. It leaves for a lot of potential for that cold air to shift further south than maybe anticipated. Now, again, none of that's a guarantee, but one thing I also keep an eye on whenever we see these pushes is there already any cold air in place around the AO region? It looks like the cold air is already retreated by the time we get into January, all the way into Canada and maybe pushing a little bit further south. So when that air mass starts to come in, I do think there might be a little bit of a sink that occurs here. There's another trough, another feature that pops up over here just around the western parts of Canada that we'll have to watch here. If that trough were to deepen, that cold air ends up pushing south. If it stays as is right now, cold air is going to be confined a little bit further off to the north here. But I think the northeastern states could be cooler than average at times, especially during the very beginning to middle parts of winter, particularly. By the time we get into March, we look like we're trying to level off, but there could be yet another signal towards the very end of winter. So like I said, this is going to be one of those winters where we're going to be scratching our heads here a bit. It's going to be, I do think there's going to be a lot of shifting as well to go along with this. There's going to be a lot of shifts, especially further off towards the south. The northern states, I think, will be a little bit more consistent, but it's kind of hard to tell at this point. It's just really, it's going to be a really unpredictable seat. It's really, well, I wouldn't say unpredictable, but kind of hard to predict at this point. And this is also pretty well highlighted with the temperature anomaly here. As you can see, for December, a lot of us still end up being above average here, with the far northern states only being below over the 30-day average here. But as we know, especially with what's coming up towards the end of next week, particularly, that this doesn't fully tell the story of what each month is going to be like. The first couple of weeks of December, particularly, are going to be cooler than average, especially towards the northern states, and a lot of cold air will make its way to the deep south. If we go into January, you can see a bigger push of that. Again, this is where I'm thinking the polar plunges, maybe even polar vortexes, start to come into play. Now, again, I don't think this is going to be entirely a predominant pattern, but there's going to be at least, I would expect maybe at least one, potentially even two cold pushes possibly. Now, again, as I mentioned before, looking at 30-day averages and also looking at stuff that's well over 30 plus days in advance, there's a lot of room for change. And then by the time we get into February, you can see that we kind of level back out here. This is when we have a weaker stratospheric heating signature or signal, and as a result, we look like we start to warm back up. And this also kind of leads me to have some intrigue for severe weather potential, maybe even towards Dixie Alley. I can't even rule out the plains at this point. It just really depends on how the troughing will end up behaving as we go forward. And then it even becomes more paramount that severe weather becomes possible, of course, as we head towards the end of winter and into March, which would be the technical start of meteorological spring, which would be March 1st. So, like I said, a lot of moving parts with this upcoming outlook and ultimately what will be a forecast. But obviously right now, I'm intrigued particularly by not just the very beginning of winter, but I would say the end of winter as well. The middle point, I think, is probably going to be pretty chaotic as well, considering the fact that we have those signals that we have for stratospheric heating. If we continue to have those, that could make for some interesting conditions at times, to say the least. Now, of course, this always is going to coincide with our precip outlooks. We already mentioned it before with the deep south. We're expecting drier than average conditions for the most part here towards the southeast. The ridge is going to play a big part in that. And then to start out the season, the west is going to be a little bit quieter than what it normally is whenever we have a La Nina year. I do think there's going to be some outliers here, especially towards the Sierra Nevadas, though. Especially as we get towards the back half of the month, we start to go on the other end of that really quickly. We start to see some above average signals popping up here. But most of the action is going to be mainly resigned to the Rockies over here, and then here comes that signal over towards the Ohio Valley for increased precip with below average temperatures possible there. I do predict potential for multiple wintry systems possible there. And then at this point, it does look like we start to get some Gulf moisture flow back into play here. And with those above average temperatures, it does lead me to think there's going to be some potential severe weather as we get into February, but even. And then that signal only becomes more profound by the time we get into March here as well. With those cooler than average temperatures coming into play here, I think March could be a pretty interesting month. Potentially pretty chaotic, but we'll have to see what happens there. Obviously, the storm track and the overall weather pattern is going to be the final determining factor, so to speak. Now, here's where things kind of get interesting, especially for a lot of my fellow weather nerds here, is when I was looking at the analogs, there's three particular years that came into mind here. The first one that I saw was the 1985 and 86 signal here. It almost kind of coincides perfectly with what we're expecting for this winter here. You can see that this is pretty much like right on the edge of a weak La Nina and neutral Enso right here, where we have the negative 0.5 degrees Celsius temperature over the Enso region. Then another year that I looked up was 1984. We were transitioning from a weak La Nina, or actually a strong, or a potentially a more notable moderate La Nina, all the way into a neutral Enso by the time we got into January and February. So that signal, I would count that signal as well. But we're pretty much right on the edge of a weak La Nina at this point, heading into a neutral by the time we get towards December, January, and February up here. So when I look at that, and then I also take a look at 1967. You could also make an argument for 64, but 1966 and 67 actually seems like it's another good signal here. Although this one kind of deepens. So I would say at this point, the two signals I'm going to pay the most attention to would be the 1986 and 1984 and 85 U.S. winters, or 1986 and 87. So it's kind of back-to-back years where we had the shifts. And like I said, the most profound signal I've seen was 86. We had a mix of severe storms and unusual temperature swings. And a great example of that was December, which ironically, if we look at the headlines, if I were to go back here, go back to home and take a look at this CPC message, which has been updated regularly, by the way, might I add, you can see that we have a pretty profound signal here for below average temperatures coming in and pushing almost as far south as South Georgia here, with the greatest signal, of course, being towards the northern states. Then if we look here, you can see that shift occur pretty quickly, where we're going below average towards the deep south, towards well above average for a lot of areas, especially for the Florida Peninsula and even the Panhandle. Southeast also goes from being, if we were to move this back to the left here, being 33 to 40% chance of being below average 1 week to the next week being all the way up to 50 to 60% above average on the above average temperature swing here. So pretty big shift here. Like I said, I've been saying it for a while. Definitely want to make sure that you have all the faculties needed to keep your immunity up, because this is going to be a trying season if you ask me. But this almost kind of resonates perfectly with what we were talking about there. I do think that with the other signals we were seeing, that we could see potential for winter weather even towards the East Coast. And then also February, ironically, it also talked about tornadoes in Southeast Georgia and Florida. February, that signal that we were just looking at, ironically, coincides almost perfectly with this. And then also, even though this technically isn't winter, by the time we look towards April in 1986, we had late season blizzards that were occurring and spring snowstorms over towards the Northeast and the Rockies as well. So something else we need to pay attention to going forward. Like I said, this seems like the kind of signal where we could still have lingering effects that could go all the way past the end of what would be considered meteorological winter. 1984, another signal that we can talk about there. It's kind of a similar look here. We have an early January cold wave that was expected there. I can't guarantee exactly that that would be the same thing, but it's a relatively identical signal, I would say. But this cold blast in January was historic because in some areas we were dealing with wind chills as low as about 60 degrees below zero. This was like the deep freeze that happened in the early phase of winter, which was December, January. Then we have the historic blizzard on February 4th and 5th in the upper Midwest. We even had 80-mile-per-hour winds with that, creating ground blizzard conditions. And then we also had lingering winter storms that even occurred into March. So, two profound signals that are identical to what we were seeing here. Definitely something that kind of piques my interest. Like I said, this part of the video, again, is more or less for those that are more into the analytical side of things when it comes to severe weather. These are some good analogs. If anyone has been around during this time of year, I know we have some folks that have been around a minute in the that have been watching our videos. So if you were around and you actually witnessed any of these events between 1984 and 86, definitely would love to see some comments down there. But in any case, this has been a long video already. It's been over 20 minutes, so I'm going to end it here. Appreciate you all tuning in. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. We'll be talking severe weather tomorrow as there is a slight risk issued for Monday. But till then, everyone take care and have a wonderful rest of your Saturday.